Hello, I'm going to talk about the rate limiter, a relatively common system design interview question. So I'm going to focus more on like high-level design and architecture, probably a bit less on specific like algorithm implementations, but it's always like you would need to figure out what's exactly needed from you during the interview. So topics we are going to cover is clarifying the questions and requirements, high-level design, then choosing an algorithm and kind of how to apply the rate limiter, and some security considerations as well. So clarifying questions is where like a lot is going to get decided, and specifically for rate limiter, there's like a lot of possibilities. First of all, is what we are trying to protect. Is it just like in monoliths service calls to expensive functions where there's like no network involved at all? Is it like network call just between internal microservices? Or is it like small volume sensitive calls from external users, like such as like password resets, which you need to like have a relatively small amount at least per user? Then should we use in-memory store or a centralized store like Redis? Like first one is less accurate, but faster. Second one is like more accurate. It gives you like accurate counts of like how many requests for a given like endpoint was there, etc. But it's also slower. So you need to figure out how important the accuracy is. For example, do we intend to scale the number of service pods if we're close to being rate limited, just to like have a bad trade-off between service fulfilling like its requirements and cost and just like being available? And also, shall we build like a hybrid solution maybe? Like with both in-memory store and centralized store, where like different rate limiters are plugged in different pieces of our system? Or should we focus on more like some specific case? Maybe, like just protecting on the API gateway level, and that's it. And then like if you're usually it's asked for like a staff level or above, but people may look into what's the business use case. Like you need to ask questions something like, is it like internal rate limiter or some SaaS solution, for example, or are we building some like system like Istio for service mesh and rate limit is a part of it? And what kind of would suffer if rate limit is exceeded like 2x, 10x, 100x? Like, I don't know, maybe we just like scale out the service and that's kind of okay. Maybe you don't even need rate limit as much. You can just kind of throw money at a problem. I mean, of course, for rate limiter question, it's not gonna be like that easy to get off the hook, but you may need to ask these questions, and like interviewer need to like also have something prepared for this. So you would need to understand, for example, like what's the impact on accuracy. For example, suppose there are some endpoints which are really expensive, where it's like even like 2x in exceeding would be like super bad. Or alternatively, it may be like exact accuracy may not matter, but we don't want like, I don't know, 100x increase in traffic or something. All of this needs to be like figured out. And in general, you need to figure out how the traffic patterns look like between services and endpoints. Like, for example, do we have a setups where it's like one service has a cache and calls another service if cache miss happens? If so, for example, you can suffer from a situation where like cache gets busted for some reason, and then you hit with a surge of requests you normally don't hit. So yeah, like there is a lot of questions, and depending on the answers, things can go like very different ways. I would assume that if you are like a more junior or like mid-level candidate, probably more focus would be on the algorithm itself, which I'm gonna briefly talk about later. If you are more like senior or staff level or above, most likely it's gonna be on like integration with systems, analyzing trade-offs and like various pieces of the system, like interaction with all of this and how the traffic moves. Maybe how can we even prevent the underlying problems. For now, I'll assume that we're gonna try to like talk about like hybrid solution, where in-memory and centralized stores for different use cases can be present. Then rate limiting would be for like internal use. It's not going to be like SaaS or anything like that. Maybe like a modest setup. We are going to protect both cases of high traffic search and low traffic search for sensitive endpoints, such as like password resets. And then we also assume that it doesn't have to be like super accurate, and that availability and performance matters more. And at least for like non-security use cases, where you're protecting against a search, like really, if it's like, if say adding plus 10% of traffic to the endpoint or the service can like bring things down like much more like in significant way, then it's already like things are on the like tipping on the balance, so something is wrong. So you should have like much more like leeway. And for high-level design, let's talk about the thing where like approach that can work is like you build a library and it can be integrated with request flow by using different means. It can be addition to the service code directly, plugins for systems like Istio, maybe even microservice which can talk to external store like Redis, and then your systems talk to this microservice, or maybe like Istio system talk to this microservice. All of this kind of can be possible. And for in-memory rate limit, you can like add it to each microservice using some proxy or like middleware, for example, depending on the programming language you use. You can also add the one close to the edge of the network, for example, an API gateway or load balancer, to make sure they are protected. Note that if you're using some like cloud provider, they'll likely have some like built-in rate limiting. But we are assuming that we're trying to cover all kinds of cases for where rate limiting can be useful. But if your interviewer tells you that, hey, we can like assume that that part is covered, let's maybe focus on like internal services more, then you know that, hey, okay, it's like slightly different use case. You can probably focus more on like preventing traffic surges, worry a bit less about like security implications. For distributed rate limit, strongly consider integrating with the service mesh or adding it if not present, because otherwise you essentially like building some components of service mesh. Let's say if you have like a library inside of each service which talks like to something on the network, you already have a flow that you kind of request gets in, it gets out to this like centralized service and then gets back in. That's like a pattern which is very similar to service mesh. So that's gonna make things easier, whether it's like using some system like Istio built-in rate limiter, or like maybe integrating your own system using a plugin. That's all can be like can make things significantly easier. You really don't want a rate limit itself to become like a bottleneck. And then one more important consideration, you need to have tooling to adjust rate limits quickly in case of some incident. Like for example, there some floodgates opened, cache expired, and like now one service spams another service. Or there is some external DDoS attack. You need to adjust rate limits. Suppose you like figured out which endpoints needs to be rate limited. Have some like numbers in mind, but you need to be able to apply it really quickly. Usually config management system takes care of this. But it depends. Like for example, security may require you to like normally have a pull request review or some sort of that of a sort for like config changes in normal circumstances. But this is kind of like a break glass flow, so you need to like make sure you have something for that use case. It all depends. Like probably if like again if you're like more like a junior or mid-level candidate, I don't think the interviewer would grill you as much on this part. If you're like a senior staff candidate or above, like it's a good idea to talk about those things, that you basically need to like work with different teams, coordinate with them, figure out how the landscape looks like from, for example, security perspective. And again, probably like all of this is like pretty complex, so during the interview you don't have to cover like all of it. So talk with the interviewer, make sure you're on the same page about what's covered, what's not. Maybe you can cover more things, but be more like shallowly, or cover less things but like more deeply. It like basically agree with the interviewer about like what you both like wanna go with. Now choosing an algorithm, it can be multiple things. It can be the specific code which uses a store or is like counters or something, and evaluates whether to let the request through, or when to use which rate limiter architecture. So for specific code algorithms, like common fixed window, token bucket, leaky bucket, some approximate sliding window. All of them have their pros and cons. They're all like well described on the internet. I'm not gonna go into like much detail. I've seen some success with like various of those. Like some of them they have challenges with like tuning specific parameters, but I would say maybe fixed window is a bit too naive, although it's a bit simple. But all others can be, I think it's production grade. So I suggest you like to actually like look it up during the interview preparation and see how the algorithms are exactly implemented. So if needed, you can go over them. But that by itself can like be quite big. So I'm gonna be focusing more on like kind of high level concepts and high level design. And then like some considerations in that sort. If you have a very cheap function like sum of two numbers, typically don't use rate limit at all, even in memory one, because then rate limit would be just more expensive than what you're trying to protect, and would become a bottleneck, right? So then you can consider using it if there are some security consideration. I don't know, like imagine it's some like validation of some like password or something, which can maybe you can compute some hash with salt or something. I don't know. Like I'm not gonna go into like very specifics of what it can be, but for that one you may just have different considerations that you don't want to limit how many times this is called. Although this kind of setup in the first example, it kind of assumes that we are already like past the first layers of the network and we're already in some like monolith code. So we should probably have some rate limits like closer to the network edge as well. But then similar principle applies for in-memory store versus centralized store. Like basically, yeah, network calls to Redis and Redis queries themselves takes time. So if your like function you're trying to protect is also just like, I don't know, maybe like some Redis calls or maybe simple network calls, again, probably don't use the centralized store. Again, unless you have some like very specific accuracy considerations or like security considerations. But regularly, yeah, it's just like this principle applies, that evaluate how expensive is what you're trying to protect, get some metrics, get some like data, maybe like some latency or CPU or like other resource, which can be like a bottleneck. And only use centralized store for if like have some something like maybe complex SQL queries with joins, or yeah, like security requirements or whatnot. And then let's talk about security a bit more. So bad actors can do great lengths to like user rate limiting against you if it's not set up well. For example, if you have like total rate limit per hour for a password set for all users, hackers can just like spam the endpoint, and if you don't have protections for that, you can just like have the rate limit exceeded, and then hackers can just deny like regular users' ability to use the password reset. So it's like a kind of DDoS attack, although it's like not DDoS by like removing availability by like overloading the service, but it's more like by using rate limit to like play a bad actor essentially. So for external traffic, again, it's like a probably pretty big topic. It probably wouldn't have much time to an interview to discuss it in depth. I would just say that for external traffic, prefer some rate limit, for example, per user identifier or per IP address. And then in any case, be ready to like react. For example, like you may have some support cases opened if some users hitting your rate limits all the time. Like you just need to be ready to apply rate limits, maybe remove rate limits or readjust them or add them in some cases, like if it's just a new DDoS attack, for instance. Also, like existing systems, like for example, cloud providers, they can offer some like DDoS protection for you. And normally you would probably just use some of that at least. But it's overall like very tricky thing. Like production grade rate limit for like from protection with external DDoS attack is actually a really hard problem. And probably like reasonable interviewer would not expect you to like solve all of that. For internal traffic though, you can assume a bit more like trust, that it's like if something happens, it's more like an accident, and mostly worry about like traffic surges. For example, when some cache gets busted, how do you like make sure that it gets refilled over time, but also doesn't like make underlying service unavailable. Yeah, that would be it for me for today. Thank you. Let me know if you have any questions.